So several years ago, I worked as an HIV prevention counselor at AIDS Services in Orange County, AIDS Services Foundation. And it was a free service that we offered people. And the way it worked was that people would come in for an HIV test, which I would administer. And then there was about 20 or 25 minutes before the test results came in, and I would sit with them and counsel them. Now, when I started the work, I thought the counseling was going to be all about technical ways that people could lessen their risk for HIV. But I very quickly learned that was not the case. I'll never forget one evening, just as we were about to close, a young man came to the center, and I said, oh, I'll stay a little late and do the test for him. And so he came in, and I administered the test, and I sat down with him. And this was a young man who was an immigrant. He was a person of color, and his English was halting, but we could understand each other. And he expressed surprise as he sat with me, and I started to ask questions about his life. And I think he wondered, what was the agenda here, as people often did? Why aren't they asking about my life? The more we talked, the more I began to realize that this young man had no connections, no meaningful connections anyway. There was no family here. There were no friends. There was no network of communities that he could reach out to for support. He was trying to find his way through life and figure out his various identities all by himself. Now, when the test came back, that was the first positive HIV test that I had. And I broke the news to the young man, and we talked about what his options were and the resources that were available. But what I remember most is that as he left the facility, the parking lot was dark. The cars were gone, except for his and mine. And it was as though I were just sending him out into the darkness, that it was swallowing him up. As time went on, I realized this was a recurring theme, that most of the work I was doing was not about talking to people about particular ways that they could prevent HIV, but about their connections or their lack of connections in the world. It was a common theme. People didn't have communities. They didn't have families that had welcomed them and supported them on their journey to figure out who they were. They felt very much alone in the world. And I started to think, there has to be a better way. For me, the answer is right here. This is what I figured out. I'm sure there are other things out in the world, but there's not enough of them, right? And this is a place. Unitarian Universalist community is a place where people can connect in a way that is so often hard to find in our world today. It's a place where we can ask these big questions about life and purpose and meaning and who we are and why we're here and how we identify ourselves, and people will be with us on that journey, knowing those questions may never get satisfactorily answered. I remember the very first time Lawrence and I went to a UU congregation, my husband Lawrence. He loves when I point him out during the service. There he is, sitting over there. But we went to a UU congregation, and at the beginning of the service there, the moment that Tara led this morning, where people greet each other. And so there was this lovely woman sitting next to us, and she was very happy that we were new that morning, and she welcomed us and introduced herself, and we introduced ourselves. And then she said, "Please, please, please, if you have any questions, let us know." And then she turned away. And then she turned back and she said, "And please, 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 if you have any answers, let us know." And I thought, I'm home, right? I'm home because this is a place that is not only accepting and inviting me in with who I am, but they're also saying, we can learn from your presence here, that you might have answers to bring to us as well, that together we can do this journey, this imperfect journey, and find our way toward something. I'm so grateful since then to have learned so much more about this tradition, because it's not just something that, sprung up in the 1960s with hippies and so on. This is a tradition that has been around for so long. We can go all the way back to about 200 in the Common Era and talk about Origen of Alexandria. I am going way back, right? Whew. All the way back to Origen of Alexandria, the first Unitarian and Universalist that we know about. And what did that mean for Origen? That meant that Origen did not believe that people were damned to some sort of eternal hell. It just didn't make sense. He believed that if a God exists, that God would be a loving God that would ultimately reconcile with all of humanity. And that's the Universalist side. The Unitarian side of Origen said that humans had agency, that humans had power to make change in the world, that humans didn't need to just be passive and wait for God to decide what would happen to them, that humans actually could take an active role in that. That's 200 CE. We go forward in time, we go all the way up to the 1500s, and these Unitarians and Universalist threads are still being woven throughout history in various places and various times with various people. We get to someone named Francis David. He's in Hungary, and he's got these Unitarian ideas. And he goes to the king and tells him about everything that he's been studying about Unitarianism. And the king gets excited about this. And together they create something called the Edict of Torda back in 1500s, the first written religious freedom proclamation, Unitarian. Around the same time in Spain, there's a man named Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus is a scholar, he's a thinker, he's an academic, he's a rationalist, and he also believes in the power of human agency. And so Michael Servetus says that all people are welcome into being appreciated for who they are, that they all have worth and dignity. And he also, as he's doing his scholarship, he writes a book called On the Errors of the Trinity. Now, this didn't go over very well, so they burn him at the stake, unfortunately. And you have to remember, we've got the name Unitarian. One of the reasons we have the name Unitarian is because this was a really big deal, the Unitarian versus Trinitarian controversy. But the reality is that wasn't really always the big argument for most of the Unitarians in history. Their big thing was, can we use our rational minds and our scholarship and what we know to read sacred text and do that in such a way that maybe our interpretation differs from what has been the norm? Now, the sticking point for the other side was the Unitarian-Trinitarian thing. That was the thing they were hung up on. So it's kind of like today, if, let's say, you believe in medical science, but people on the other side just call you a pro-vaccine person, a vaxitarian. Let's say they call you that, right? And at some point, you're like, but it's not just about vaccines, it's about all of medical science. But they're like, yeah, you're a vaxitarian. And finally, you're like, fine, call us vaxitarians. In fact, we're going to form a vaxitarian organization. But we're also interested in all these other things. That's exactly, almost, what happened for Unitarians. You move forward to the United States. You have a woman named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Anybody ever heard of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper? Say her name with me because her name has been forgotten. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is a black woman in the 1800s, and she is amazing. She is a Unitarian, and she is a suffragette. She's an abolitionist, and she is the first black female published novelist at the time, and it was a bestseller. This woman was amazing, a Unitarian who was trying to make that circle larger so that everyone could be part of it. As we look back at all of our history and where we come from and what these people were trying to do, what I think it boils down to is what we talked about before with the kids. This idea of love at the center. All these people were saying that love is large enough to include everybody. Love is large enough to include our brains and our hearts. It's large enough to include our critical thinking. It's large enough for us to include all the people that maybe we don't quite understand, but they're part of the human spectrum. They're part of humanity. And I think, especially the last couple of weeks, I think about how much this matters now more than ever. When we see something like that horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk, and then also we see the horrific response to it in the way that the harm of some of his words and deeds are being washed over, the complexity of all of that, as we hold all of that, as we see the school shooting that happened yet again, terrorizing families and people in the United States, as we see the trans policies that are being enacted or how they're threatening to consider trans people part of an extremist group, even a terrorist group. As we see the global turmoil, that ongoing cycle of violence and despair in Gaza, Israel, all of these things, we start to wonder, where is love at the center? It doesn't seem like it's at the center of most of these things, does it? I think about love at the center in our congregations. I know this is kind of an abstract concept for some people, because they think, what does love mean? I think sometimes it's easier to tell you what it looks like rather than try and define what it means. So I'll tell you what I think it looks like in our recent UU past right here in this area. I think love at the center was a UU minister standing on the courthouse steps in Santa Ana, day in and day out, right before the Prop 8 vote was taken, which made same-sex couples lose the right to marry. She stood there and she offered to officiate weddings for any same-sex couples who came up those steps. That's love at the center. Love at the center is this congregation 12 or more years ago, maybe more at this point, starting the Friends of Orange County Detainees. Not just sitting with people in detention centers, but connecting meaningfully and deeply with them, forging relationships, letting immigrants into their lives and holding relationships with them to this very day. That's love at the center, folks. Love at the center is a regular Sunday morning where people are going up and lighting candles. And this young woman that has only been there a few times before, a few people over here notice there's something in her face that just looks off that morning. It's not extreme, but there's something they see there. And they go to the minister right after the service and they say, there's something up with that woman. Will you check in with her? We don't even know her name, but there's just something there in her eyes. And the minister meets with her and she says, this was going to be my last day on earth. And because the people here noticed the distress I was in, I feel like I'm empowered to make a different choice. That's love at the center, folks. Love at the center is found in our UU communities. It's not found, unfortunately, out there these days in politics. It's not found in a lot of our governmental systems. It's not found in corporations. It's not found in Disney. It's not found in those places. We can't look to all of those places to be our moral compass. We have to recalibrate our own moral compasses by being in a community like this one. It's a countercultural thing. It's something that we do so that we continue to remember that we belong somewhere, that we are part of humanity. And I want to tell you something. Being a minister is a very strange vocation. I question it daily. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that, but I think that probably the times I'm a good minister is that also the times I'm questioning it, right? But coming to a new community, I hold every anxiety and fear and sense of trepidation and all of that anyone else coming to a new community. I wonder if I'm enough, if people will like me, if I'll be able to get to know the names and faces and say the right things and do the right things. I hold all of that, just like anyone else who finds their way to a community. And what I found here is I really believe Tapestry has that love at its center. I don't think you're missing that. I really don't. I think it's here. And I think you just need to continue to remind yourselves of it, because it is such a precious and beautiful thing. And there are people out in the world, like that young man that I unfortunately had to send out in the dark that one day, that could desperately use a community like this as a place to anchor themselves and find meaning in the world. So I come back to that greeter, that woman next to us all those years ago who said, if you have any answers, let us know. Well, I'm going to let you know. One answer I think I have. Love. It's an answer. It may be the answer. But like any answer, it's not the end-all and be-all. It's actually what we do with love. It's the infinite possibilities that love allows us to create. That's why it's important. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing not just for our lives, but for the lives of everyone.